A visit to the bank. Just another ordinary day for clients waiting in line, until a millionaire loses his temper and shoves his pregnant wife onto the marble floor in front of everyone. He thinks money will silence the crowd. He thinks humiliation will keep her powerless. But he has no idea who just walked out from behind the glass office. The manager is not just any banker. He is her trillionaire uncle. And what follows is a storm of family power, shattered pride, and a downfall no one saw coming. Stay with us, because you will not believe how this ends. And before we dive in, let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The marble floor of the downtown bank gleamed under the weight of chandeliers that cast a golden light across the crowded lobby. Wealthy clients in tailored suits waited in line with their portfolios tucked under their arms. A row of tellers clicked away at keyboards while soft background music floated through the air. For a moment, the bank was a sanctuary of routine transactions and quiet ambition. But that illusion was about to shatter. At the center of the lobby stood a pregnant woman in a cream-colored dress. Her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, she looked fragile but composed, her posture careful, as if each breath carried both her and the life inside her. Beside her was her husband, a millionaire dressed in a sleek black suit, his tie knotted perfectly, his face rigid with arrogance. He was not here for a simple withdrawal. He was here to make a statement. He spoke loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear, his voice dripping with disdain. "You embarrass me every time we step into public," he sneered, ignoring the fact that she was trembling. "Do you know how humiliating it is to stand next to someone who clings like a shadow?" Guests waiting nearby shifted uncomfortably. Heads began to turn. The music from the speakers suddenly seemed out of place, too cheerful for the storm that was gathering. The woman whispered back, her voice almost breaking, "Please, not here. Everyone is watching." Her hand gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She tried to steady herself, but her husband had no intention of stopping. In one swift, cruel motion, he placed his hand on her shoulder and shoved her forward. The force was enough to send her stumbling across the polished floor. A gasp tore through the lobby. She landed hard on her side, her arms curling protectively around her stomach. For a second, time seemed to freeze. Clients dropped their pens. A teller covered her mouth in horror. A child in line began to cry, clutching his mother's hand. The millionaire did not flinch. He stood tall, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing had happened. "Stand up," he barked. "Do not make a scene." His words cut sharper than the shove, as if her pain was not real, as if her body was not carrying his child. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of fluorescent lights. And then came the sound of phones being raised. One by one, witnesses held their cameras high. Screens lit up, capturing the woman sprawled on the floor, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, her body shaking from shock. Whispers spread like fire. "Did he just push her?" someone muttered. "She is pregnant," another voice answered, thick with outrage. The bank, once a place of financial order, had become a theater of cruelty. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the fallen woman and the man who towered over her. She struggled to sit up, one hand cradling her stomach, the other pressing against the cold marble to lift herself. Her breaths came in ragged bursts. She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The question formed silently on her lips, "How could you?" But the millionaire's expression showed no remorse. To him, the audience was irrelevant. The cameras were meaningless. He believed his power was untouchable, his wealth a shield that could protect him from consequence. He believed he had the right to humiliate her anywhere, even in public, even in a bank filled with witnesses. The audience inside the lobby felt the air shift. It was no longer the comfortable stillness of a bank on a weekday afternoon. It was charged, electric, alive with the knowledge that they had seen something unforgivable. What had begun as a normal day of deposits and withdrawals had become the moment that no one present would ever forget. And yet, the story had only just begun. The shove was not the climax. It was the opening blow, the spark that would ignite a chain of revelations. Because hidden within that very bank, behind the glass offices and polished desks, was someone who would not let this act of cruelty go unanswered. The millionaire believed he had silenced his wife with a single push. What he did not know was that the walls themselves were watching, and that within minutes, his arrogance would collide with a truth far more powerful than his money. The bank lobby was frozen in silence after the shove. For a brief second, no one moved, no one breathed, as if the marble walls themselves were holding their breath. The only sound was the faint echo of the background music that had not yet been turned off, its cheerful rhythm mocking the tragedy that had just unfolded. The woman lay on the cold floor, her hands wrapped protectively around her stomach. Her cream-colored dress, so carefully chosen for the day, was now crumpled and stained with dust. A single tear rolled down her cheek, cutting through the smear of mascara that blurred her eyes. She tried to rise, but her legs trembled, and her body refused to obey. Every attempt to push herself up only reminded her of the weight she carried, the life inside her that she was terrified of losing. The crowd began to stir. Gasps turned into whispers, whispers into murmurs. A teller dropped her pen, the small clatter echoing louder than it should have in the suffocating silence. An older man in a gray suit shook his head, muttering to the woman beside him, "I cannot believe what I just saw." A younger woman pulled out her phone, her hand shaking as she pressed record. The faint red light of her camera blinked like an alarm in the room. The millionaire, standing tall above the chaos he had created, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate calm. He acted as though nothing had happened, as though his wife lying on the floor was no more than a minor inconvenience. His face showed no guilt, no hesitation, only cold arrogance. His voice cut through the stillness. "Get up, stop pretending." The cruelty of the words made the room flinch. A mother holding her child turned away, shielding the boy's eyes. A young man clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, but he did not move forward. The power of the millionaire still hung heavy in the air, unchallenged, intimidating. The woman's hand trembled as she touched her belly, searching for reassurance. She whispered softly to herself, words no one else could hear, a prayer that her child was safe. Her other hand pressed against the floor, trying once more to rise, but her knees gave way. The marble was unforgiving. She collapsed again, a soft cry escaping her lips. Around her, the whispers grew louder. "Did he really push her?" someone asked. Another voice answered, sharper, filled with anger. "She is pregnant." Everyone saw it. The bank was no longer a sanctuary of business. It was a stage, and every customer, every teller, every guard had become a witness to cruelty. The music stopped abruptly. One of the employees behind the counter had turned it off, unable to let the melody mask the horror. The sudden silence was even more suffocating. It magnified every breath, every shuffle of feet, every sniffle of the woman on the floor. The millionaire looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw the phones raised, the cameras pointed directly at him. For a moment, a flicker of unease crossed his face, but it vanished just as quickly. He straightened his back and sneered. "Do you think anyone will believe you? I own this city. No one will care." The crowd recoiled at his words. Shock had turned into anger, but the weight of his wealth still pressed down like a heavy curtain, stopping anyone from stepping forward. Yet beneath that silence, something was building. The witnesses were not simply shocked. They were recording. They were remembering. They were preparing to speak. The woman finally managed to lift herself onto her knees, her hair falling over her face, strands sticking to her tear-streaked skin. Her hands shook as she wiped her eyes, smearing her makeup further. She looked up at her husband, her lips trembling, but her gaze was no longer just fear. It carried disbelief, sorrow, and the faint spark of defiance. In that moment, the bank was no longer just a building of glass and marble. It had become a courtroom, silent but alive with judgment. Every person in the room knew what they had witnessed. Every eye was fixed on the millionaire, and every phone was proof of what he had done. The aftershock of his cruelty lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. The silence in the lobby was not weakness. It was the quiet before the reckoning. The silence in the bank had become unbearable. All eyes were on the millionaire, yet he stood tall, adjusting his jacket as if he were on the stage of a gala instead of a scene of violence. He knew the cameras were recording. He knew his wife was still on the floor, but instead of showing remorse, he opened his mouth to rewrite the narrative. "You all saw it," he declared, his voice echoing across the marble lobby. "She lost her balance. I barely touched her. His words carried the confidence of a man who believed his money could reshape reality. He raised a hand toward the onlookers, as if inviting them to nod along with his version of events. The woman on the floor shook her head weakly, her lips forming the word no, but he ignored her. He pressed forward. She has been overdramatic since the pregnancy. Hormones, emotions, all of it. She creates problems where none exist. He gave a short laugh, cold and calculated, as if to reassure the witnesses that they were simply watching a family quarrel exaggerated by a fragile wife. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, their disbelief visible. A man near the counter muttered, "That was no stumble." He pushed her. A teller whispered to another, "He is lying. We all saw it." But the millionaire's voice carried over theirs, filling the space like a storm. He pointed at his wife with a dismissive gesture. "She wants pity. She wants attention. That is what this is. Do not be fooled." His words sliced through the tension, but they did not heal it. They only deepened the divide between his arrogance and the truth everyone had witnessed. He turned his attention to the phones raised in the air. "Stop recording," he ordered, his tone commanding. "You are violating my privacy." His face hardened as he added, "Anyone who posts that video will regret it. I have lawyers. I have power. I can destroy reputations overnight." His threats hung in the air like a blade. The crowd did not lower their phones. Instead, a woman in a red coat lifted hers higher. A man in line whispered to his neighbor, "Let him threaten. The video is already live." The millionaire's eyes flickered with the first signs of unease, but his pride would not let him stop. He crouched slightly toward his wife, lowering his voice just enough for those nearest to hear. "Get up. Stop this act. You are embarrassing me." His hand reached out, not in comfort, but in control, fingers curling as though ready to grip her arm and force her to stand. She flinched back, her eyes wide, refusing to let him touch her again. For a heartbeat, the image was clear. A powerful man trying to rewrite reality, a pregnant woman trembling on the floor, and a crowd caught between fear and outrage. The millionaire rose back to his full height, spreading his arms as if addressing a courtroom. "You think you understand us. You do not. This is private. My wife has been difficult, ungrateful, always questioning me. She is the problem, not me." His tone carried false reason, the practiced defense of someone who had used excuses all his life. But this time, the excuses did not land. The audience did not nod. The phones did not lower. The silence of disbelief grew heavier, thicker, louder than his words. The woman, still on the floor, found the strength to speak. Her voice was soft but clear. "They saw what you did." She looked up at him, her eyes no longer pleading but steady, holding his gaze. "You cannot twist this." "No." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. For the first time, the millionaire blinked, his confidence faltering for a split second. He quickly forced a smirk, but the damage was done. The crowd had seen the truth, and no amount of excuses could erase what had been burned into their eyes. The millionaire's smirk lingered in the air like smoke, but the silence in the bank had shifted. The crowd was no longer just shocked, they were waiting. Something was about to happen. The tension was a taut string, ready to snap. From behind the glass offices near the back of the lobby, a figure emerged. At first, his steps were quiet, deliberate, almost unnoticeable among the murmurs of the onlookers. But as he walked forward, people began to part, creating a natural aisle through the center of the bank. Heads turned, phones tilted toward him. The energy in the room changed with every step he took. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in an immaculate navy suit that seemed to carry its own authority. His posture was upright, commanding, as if years of power and discipline had been carved into his bones. His eyes were sharp, glinting with a mix of fury and control. The employees behind the counters recognized him instantly. Customers whispered his name in disbelief. It was the bank manager. But not just any manager. He was her uncle, the man whose fortune and influence dwarfed even the arrogance of the millionaire. In fact, his wealth had crossed into a level few could imagine. He was a trillionaire, a titan of finance, a figure who rarely appeared in public without a line of reporters chasing him. And now he was standing in the middle of the lobby, his gaze locked on the man who had dared to shove his pregnant niece to the ground. The millionaire's confidence faltered for the first time. He stiffened, his jaw tightening, "This is none of your business," he snapped, though his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "This is a private matter between a husband and his wife." The uncle did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Private?" His tone was measured, cold. "You shoved a pregnant woman in a public bank. You humiliated her in front of dozens of witnesses. And that woman happens to be my niece." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The phones recording the scene now had their focus split, moving from the trembling woman on the floor to the imposing man who had just revealed himself. The whispers grew louder. "Did he say niece?" one customer asked. Another added, "That man is her family, and he is more powerful than anyone in this room." The millionaire tried to recover, straightening his tie as if fabric could rebuild his crumbling authority. "She is manipulating you," he said quickly. "You do not know what she is like at home. She exaggerates. She twists things. I barely touched her." His words sounded weaker than before, as if he knew the room was slipping from his control. The uncle took another step forward, his shoes clicking against the marble. The sound was steady, like a gavel striking at the start of judgment. He looked at the millionaire with eyes that did not waver. "I watched the cameras," he said evenly. "I saw everything. Do not insult this room with lies. You!" The woman on the floor gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes again. But this time, they were not only from pain. Relief began to break through the fear. She whispered, almost inaudibly, "Uncle." The crowd stirred again, voices rising with a mix of outrage and anticipation. For the first time, the millionaire looked small. His wealth, his arrogance, his threats, all seemed paper-thin against the presence of the man who had just stepped into the light. The uncle's gaze swept across the lobby, landing on the raised phones, the recording cameras, the trembling wife. Then he turned back to the millionaire. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "You thought you could treat her like this without consequence. But today, you are standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong man." The lobby was no longer a bank. It was a courtroom, and judgment had just entered the room. The bank lobby had turned into a silent battlefield. On one side stood the pregnant woman, still kneeling on the marble floor, her hand resting on her belly, her face pale but her eyes beginning to steady. Beside her loomed her uncle, the manager of the bank, his presence radiating authority that seemed to shift the very air in the room. On the other side stood the millionaire, his pride wounded, his power questioned, yet his arrogance unwilling to let him back down. For a brief moment, the millionaire seemed caught between fear and rage. His eyes darted to the phone's recording, then back to the uncle who refused to look away. He swallowed hard, then forced a smirk across his face, as though he could still bend the situation to his will. "This is my wife," he declared loudly, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is my marriage. None of you have the right to interfere." He jabbed a finger in the air, pointing toward the crowd. "And if anyone dares post those videos, I will make sure you regret it. I have lawyers who can bleed you dry. I have influence that can destroy your lives." The threat rolled across the lobby like a dark cloud. Some of the witnesses shifted uneasily, but none lowered their phones. The woman in the red coat who had been recording from the start simply raised her phone higher. The defiance in her eyes matched the quiet resistance of others in the crowd. The millionaire's threats were losing their edge. The uncle stepped forward, his shoes clicking firmly on the marble floor. He did not need to raise his voice. "Enough," he said, calm but commanding. "You dare threaten this room? You dare threaten my staff, my clients, and my niece? You forget where you stand. This is my bank. These are my walls, and your power ends here." The millionaire's jaw clenched. He could feel the grip of control slipping from his hands. His temper flared, and in desperation he turned his fury back toward his wife. "You will regret this," he spat at her, his face twisted with anger. "Do you hear me? If you walk out of this bank without me, you will walk out with nothing. No money, no home, no child." His voice grew louder, more venomous with every word. "I will take everything from you. I will make sure you crawl back to me, begging." The words cut through the lobby like a blade. The crowd gasped, their outrage boiling over. One man shouted, "You cannot say that to her." Another voice echoed, "She is pregnant. What kind of monster are you?" The room, once bound by silence, now trembled with rising anger. The woman on the floor lifted her head. Her lips quivered, but her voice, though soft, carried strength. "You already took everything from me when you pushed me." Her words rippled through the room, silencing the whispers for a heartbeat. The uncle moved closer, now standing only a few feet from the millionaire. The difference between them was striking. One was crumbling under his own arrogance, clinging to power through threats. The other stood unshaken, his authority grounded in something much deeper than money. "You talk about taking everything from her," the uncle said steadily. "But you do not realize she is not the one standing on the edge of ruin. You are." The millionaire's face flushed red. He slammed his fist against the counter, the sound reverberating through the lobby. "I will not be humiliated by you," he growled. His voice cracked with desperation. "Do you know who I am?" The uncle did not flinch. His reply was cold and final. "I know exactly who you are, and soon, so will the world." The tension in the bank reached a breaking point. The millionaire's threats had escalated, but so had the resistance against him. What he did not realize was that his own words, spoken in arrogance and rage, were sealing his downfall. The millionaire's fist still trembled on the counter. His outburst had silenced the room for a moment, but the silence was not one of respect. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Every eye in the bank was fixed on him, not with admiration, but with disgust. He turned his glare back to his wife, who was still kneeling on the floor, her hand pressed firmly against her stomach. His face twisted with rage, and his words lashed out like whips. "Stand up, do not play the victim. You are nothing without me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a black card, the very symbol of his wealth and control, and tossed it onto the marble floor in front of her. The card slid across the stone, stopping inches from her knees. "There!" he sneered. "That is all you are worth, a piece of plastic, tied to my name, and now it is gone." He stomped his foot on the card, snapping it clean in half. The sharp crack echoed through the lobby, louder than any shout. Gasps erupted around the room. A woman near the counter covered her mouth in horror. A young man shook his head, whispering. He just cut her off in front of everyone. Phones recorded every second, zooming in on the shattered card at his feet, the symbol of control he had so carelessly destroyed. The wife's shoulders shook, her tears falling onto the floor, but there was a strength beginning to build in her eyes. Still, the humiliation of that moment pressed down like a weight. She reached out with trembling fingers, lifting the broken card from the ground. The image of her, kneeling in a public bank, clutching the snapped remains of her lifeline, was devastating. The millionaire stood tall, chest puffed, as though proud of the cruelty he had just inflicted. "From this moment on," he declared loudly, "you have nothing, no money, no support, no family. You walk out of here with empty hands." His voice carried across the lobby, each sentence meant to wound, each word a blade. The crowd erupted not with applause but with outrage. "You cannot treat her like this," a man shouted from the back. "She is your wife," another customer added, "and she is pregnant. How can you strip her dignity like that?" But the millionaire only smirked, enjoying the power of the spectacle. The bank's atmosphere shifted. Employees no longer looked at him with deference. They looked with contempt. One teller whispered, "This is going online right now." Another said, "He has destroyed himself." The glow of phone screens filled the air, every angle captured, every word recorded. The uncle stepped closer, his expression cold, his voice like steel. "You think you humiliated her," he said, staring the millionaire down. "But in reality, you have humiliated yourself. Every person here will remember this moment. Every recording will carry your words to the world, and you will never escape what you did here today." The millionaire scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously from phone to phone, from witness to witness. The confidence he had worn like armor was cracking, splintering with every second that passed. The wife, still kneeling, finally lifted her head. Mascara streaked her face, but her gaze was clear. She looked at him with sorrow, then with quiet defiance. "You broke the card," she whispered, "but you will never break me." "I?" Her words, soft yet sharp, cut deeper than his cruelty. The lobby erupted again, not in gasps this time, but in applause. It started with a single clap from the back, then spread, wave after wave, until the entire bank was filled with the sound. The humiliation he thought he had inflicted on her was now reflected back on him, magnified, irreversible. In that moment, the millionaire was no longer a man in control. He was a man exposed, unraveling in front of a crowd that would never forget. The applause faded into murmurs, but the energy in the lobby had transformed. What began as shock had become outrage, and what had been humiliation was shifting into something far more dangerous for the millionaire. The woman he had tried to break was no longer only a victim. Something in her eyes had changed. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. The streaks of mascara remained, but her face lifted with a new strength. Her knees pressed against the marble as she pushed herself upward. The crowd leaned in as if sensing the moment. Each movement was deliberate, slow, yet filled with power. She was no longer crawling. She was standing. The millionaire's lips curled into a sneer. "Do you think standing up makes you stronger?" he mocked. "You are nothing without me. Say the word and I will make sure every account in your name disappears. I can take the roof from over your head. I can take the very child you carry." His voice rose louder with each sentence, dripping with venom. But this time, his words no longer cut the way they once did. The woman's shoulders straightened, and her breathing steadied. She looked directly at him, her voice trembling at first but growing with each syllable. "You cannot take what you never gave. You cannot strip away my dignity, because it was never yours to own." The lobby erupted with gasps and whispers. Someone clapped softly, then stopped, afraid to break the tension. The millionaire froze, his face pale for a second, then twisted with rage. He stepped closer, looming over her, his finger raised like a weapon. "Enough," he hissed. "Do not embarrass me further. Sit down before you regret it." His threats hung in the air like poison. She did not flinch. Instead, she raised her chin higher. Her voice was steady now, sharp as glass. "The only one embarrassed here is you." The words struck him harder than any slap. His face reddened, and his fists clenched. The uncle watched silently, his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the scene. He did not intervene. He knew this was not his moment. This was hers. The crowd leaned in closer, their phones lifted higher, capturing every second of the shift. A woman whispered to her friend, "She is fighting back." A man near the entrance added, "She is not afraid anymore." The millionaire tried one last time to regain control. "Do not believe her," he shouted at the witnesses. "She is lying, playing the victim, twisting the truth. She has always been weak." His voice cracked as he spoke, the desperation obvious. The wife shook her head slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Weak?" she repeated, her voice ringing through the lobby. "Weak is a man who hides behind money. Weak is a man who thinks power comes from fear. Weak is a man who pushes his pregnant wife to the ground and still believes he is in control." Ugh! The words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted in applause again, louder this time, bolder, unstoppable. Phones flashed, recording not just her defiance but the millionaire's unraveling. He stood frozen, trapped by her words, trapped by the eyes of every witness, trapped by the truth he could not escape. Her hand moved gently to her stomach, a gesture of both protection and resolve. She turned to the crowd, her voice clear. "I will not be silent anymore." The declaration was simple, yet it carried the weight of years of fear and humiliation. The millionaire staggered back a step, his arrogance faltering. For the first time, he looked small, diminished, powerless. The room that once bent to his wealth was no longer his. It belonged to her. The turning point had come. The woman who had entered the bank in silence, the woman who had been pushed and humiliated, was now standing tall in defiance. And the world was watching. The air in the lobby had become electric. The wife's defiance had cracked the millionaire's armor, but the room sensed something greater was still to come. The tension pulsed like a drumbeat. Every phone stayed raised, every eye locked on the confrontation. The uncle stepped forward, his tall frame cutting through the space with the gravity of a man used to commanding attention. His face was calm but severe, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that no amount of wealth could challenge. "Enough," he said firmly. "It is time everyone here knows the truth." The millionaire turned sharply, his expression twisted in disbelief. "Stay out of this," he barked. "This is between me and my wife." His words sounded desperate, stripped of the power they once held. But the uncle ignored him. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder bound with gold clips. The sound of the metal snapping open echoed across the lobby. He laid the documents on the counter for everyone to see. "These," he declared, are the ownership records of this very bank, and they belong to my niece." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Customers leaned forward to see the papers. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances. The phones zoomed in, recording every detail, every signature, every stamp of authority. The millionaire's jaw dropped, his face drained of color. "That is impossible," he stammered. "She is nothing. She has no money, no assets, no control." The uncle's eyes hardened. "You thought you married weakness," he said. "What you did not realize is that you married into power greater than you could ever imagine. This woman you tried to humiliate is the rightful heir to a fortune that makes your empire look like dust. She is my blood, she is my heir, and she is the true owner of everything you see around you." The lobby erupted with whispers. "She owns the bank?" someone exclaimed. "She is his niece?" another voice asked, trembling with shock. The once private humiliation had transformed into a public reckoning. The wife straightened her shoulders, her tears drying on her cheeks. For the first time, she was not only defending herself, she was standing in her identity, in her power. She looked at her husband, her voice steady, ringing with finality. "You thought I needed you, but it is you who has always needed me. Without my family's wealth, without this bank, you are nothing more than a man in a suit with empty words." The millionaire staggered back a step, clutching the counter for balance. His hands shook, his mouth opened, but no words came. The mask of confidence he had worn so tightly had crumbled, leaving only fear and desperation. The uncle turned toward the witnesses, his voice carrying the authority of judgment. "You have all seen what happened here. You saw his violence, you heard his threats, and now you know the truth. He is not the man he pretends to be. He is a fraud who built his arrogance on the illusion of power." The applause that followed was thunderous. It filled the lobby, bouncing off the marble walls, rising like a storm. Customers cheered, employees clapped. Even the security guards who had once stood frozen now nodded with approval. The millionaire's face twisted with fury, but it was useless. His lies had been exposed, his cruelty laid bare, his power shattered. The truth had been spoken, and it was louder than any threat he could make. The wife looked at him one final time, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "You tried to erase me," she said softly, her words sharp as steel. "But now the world knows who I am." And with that, the revelation was complete. The woman he had pushed and humiliated was no longer the victim. She was the heir. She was the owner. She was the truth. The revelation still echoed in the marble lobby. The millionaire's wife was no longer the powerless woman he had tried to crush. She was the heir, the rightful owner, the bloodline of a trillionaire family. The truth had shattered the illusion he had built, and now the weight of consequences began to fall. The millionaire's chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes darting from face to face. Everywhere he turned, he saw contempt. The crowd no longer feared him. They judged him. Their phones remained raised, their cameras recording every twitch of his face. The silence that once worked in his favor was now a weapon against him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands, hoping for some lifeline. Instead, his face went pale. Notifications flooded the screen. News alerts, social media posts, clips from the bank already circulating. Headlines were spreading like wildfire. Millionaire pushes pregnant wife in bank lobby. Caught on camera. CEO humiliates his wife before witnesses. Bank manager reveals shocking truth about niece. He tried to dial a number, but his fingers fumbled. The call dropped before it connected. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was an email. His biggest investor had pulled out. The subject line glared in bold. "Effective immediately. All financial support is withdrawn." Another message came seconds later. "Your partnership is terminated." His empire was collapsing in real time. The uncle stood tall, watching him unravel. "Do you feel it now?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying through the room. "That is the weight of truth. That is the price of arrogance." The millionaire staggered back a step, his face slick with sweat. He muttered to himself, shaking his head. "No, this cannot be happening. They will not leave me. They cannot." His words were desperate, childlike, stripped of the power he once claimed. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads in pity, others in anger. A customer near the door said loudly, "He thought he was untouchable. Look at him now. A teller whispered to her colleague. "He has lost everything." The atmosphere of the bank had shifted from shock to a collective recognition that justice was unfolding before their eyes. The millionaire looked toward his wife, his face crumpling. "You did this," he accused, pointing a trembling finger. "You turned them against me." His voice cracked, no longer sharp with authority but broken, almost pleading. She did not flinch. Her hand rested gently on her stomach as she answered, "No, you did this to yourself. Every word, every action, every threat was yours, and now the world knows." The uncle opened the folder again, pulling out one last document. It was an official notice of legal action, signed and sealed. He placed it on the counter where everyone could see. "This is only the beginning," he said firmly. "Your violence and your fraud will be investigated. Your wealth will not protect you. Not anymore." The security guards who had stood by quietly until now stepped forward. Their presence was no longer symbolic. One of them spoke clearly, his voice firm. "Sir, you will need to come with us for questioning." The millionaire's eyes widened. "No, you cannot do this to me. I am not going anywhere." But his protests were hollow. His voice cracked, his shoulders slumped. When the guards gently but firmly took his arms, he did not resist. He had no strength left. The crowd erupted into applause once more, louder than before. Phones flashed as pictures were taken, evidence sealed into history. The once proud millionaire, who believed himself untouchable, was being led out of the bank in disgrace. The wife stood tall now, no longer trembling. Her uncle's presence was at her side, but her strength came from within. The humiliation she had endured had turned into vindication. Her husband had paid the price, and everyone in the room had witnessed it. The world outside was already buzzing with the scandal. Reporters were gathering, investors were fleeing, and his empire was collapsing piece by piece. The price he had to pay was not only financial ruin, it was the loss of power, respect, and the illusion that had defined his life. And it had all begun with a single push. The bank lobby slowly returned to order, but the echoes of what had happened would never fade. The millionaire had been led out, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away in front of strangers and cameras. His empire was collapsing, his name tarnished, his future uncertain. Yet in the center of that marble floor, a new figure had risen. The wife stood tall, her posture steady, her hand resting gently on her stomach. The tears that once blurred her vision had dried, leaving behind eyes filled with resolve. She was no longer the trembling woman who had entered the bank beside a domineering husband. She was a mother-to-be, an heir, and a woman who had found her voice in the face of cruelty. The uncle stepped closer, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. His expression was no longer cold but softened with pride. "You are safe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying warmth for the first time that day. "And you are not alone. This is your future, not his." The crowd, which had been buzzing with anger moments earlier, now shifted to admiration. Strangers approached carefully, offering words of encouragement. "You are brave," one woman said. "You showed strength for all of us." Another added, "Your child will know what courage looks like." The applause had faded into gentle murmurs of respect, a chorus of solidarity that filled the space. Cameras continued to roll, but the focus was no longer on scandal. It was on resilience. Reporters outside were already framing the narrative. The headlines were shifting, from victim to victor. Pregnant woman defies abusive millionaire. Bank heiress stands strong with family support. The story was no longer just about a man's cruelty. It was about a woman's triumph. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then she turned to the employees and clients still gathered in the lobby. Her voice was clear, confident, and unshaken. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for standing here, for witnessing the truth, for not looking away. What happened today was meant to break me, but instead, it has freed me." The words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. The crowd responded with a final round of applause, not for her humiliation but for her liberation. The uncle guided her to the manager's office, away from the chaos of the lobby. Inside, the space was quiet, lined with glass walls and heavy wooden furniture. He handed her a new card, embossed with her name. "This bank belongs to you now," he said simply. "It always has. It is time the world sees it." Her hands trembled as she accepted it, but not with fear. It was the weight of a new beginning. The card was not just a symbol of money, it was a symbol of independence, of dignity, of a future she could build for herself and her child. When she stepped back out of the office, the cameras were waiting, the flashes bright, the questions loud. But she did not hide. She stood under the lights, shoulders back, and answered with grace. "I will no longer live in silence. I will no longer be afraid. My child will be born into truth, not into lies." The moment was captured, shared, and remembered. The image of her standing in the very place she had been pushed and humiliated, now radiating strength, became the closing chapter of a story that had begun with cruelty but ended with justice. Outside, the world was ready to receive her not as a victim, but as a woman who had survived, fought back, and reclaimed her power. The millionaire's downfall would fill the headlines, but her resilience would be the legacy. The bank lobby, once stained by humiliation, was now a stage of victory. The story was no longer his, it was hers. And as she walked out of the doors, her hand on her stomach, she whispered softly, a promise meant only for the life she carried. "You will never know fear. You will only know freedom."